Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm very happy to welcome you here today at our double presentation. Both of the things we present today are devoted to the memory of Daphne Caruana Galizia. As you know, I would first like to say a couple of words about the venue that is hosting us here today, and then I will introduce our speakers, and then we will start talking about what we're here today for. So tonight we're kindly hosted by Mr. Mikhail Khodorkovsky's Open Russia Club. And as many of you know, Mikhail is one of the most outspoken and consistent critics of the current regime of Mr. Putin, as well as he is supporting various democratic initiatives in Russia and internationally. He, as many of you know, spent 10 years in modern Russian Gulag, and after release he was forced to immigrate to Berlin, and then he relocated here to London. So including in his various projects that he supports is our Justice for Journalists Foundation. It's a new organization that was only founded about a year ago, and our main aims are supporting the investigations into the violent crimes against media workers. So as a part of that mandate, we are issuing grants to support journalistic investigations, and two of them will be presented here today. Latest political developments in Malta give us hope that tireless investigative and awareness-raising work of fellow journalists and civil society activists, all of that is not in vain, and we are on the edge of seeing some justice prevail. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers today. We have Paul Caruana Galizia, son of Daphne. We have Rebecca Vincent, who is head of the London office of Reporters Without Borders. And we have Manuel Delia and John Sweeney, who are co-authors of the book that is being presented here today. So first I will give the floor to Paul, and we will continue, and then we will finish with the questions and answer session.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you everyone for coming. So I got back from Malta on Sunday, and I thought I'd start by summarizing the preceding 2 weeks, but I'm not sure I can manage, and I'm hoping someone else is going to take that on. But I will say I got to Malta a few hours before Yorgen Fenech was arrested. So Fenech was someone who had long been a suspect in my mother's assassination. And at about 6 in the morning, my phone started going with messages that Fenech's boat is being raided, Fenech's under arrest. And then I started getting photos of soldiers on his yacht. And I thought that the significance of that moment is that this is where it all falls apart, because there's no way Fenech is going to go down quietly. And if they have enough on him, then they have enough on all these other people. And sort of sure enough, over the following few days, you just saw them falling one by one, one by one. And what happened in Malta is really, I think, nothing short of extraordinary. And not just that these men were interrogated. You know, one in particular, Keach can be released, which is really the most shocking event, actually, of the past 3 weeks. But the most impressive thing has been the civil society response. So that same day that Fenech was arrested, we saw this spontaneous protest outside Parliament in Valletta, and it was just beyond belief. You know, people, you had this sense that the crowd that gathered there had for 2 years been called crazy, they'd been called conspiracy theorists, they'd been called mad. You know, how can it be that the government's involved? You know, it isn't a political assassination, it's just a murder, they would often say. And then finally, you know, in that one moment, it all fell away, and people were furious, rightly, I think. So we had that really incredible and personally I found very satisfying scene of a crowd around the Justice Minister's car, screaming at him, shouting at him, throwing coins at his car. And it's just been unrelenting. It's been day after day, a protest after protest, multiple in the same day. And it's a real, I think, testament to all those people, civil society and journalists who in Malta are doing unbelievable work, including, by the way, spotting Fenix yacht sailing out of his marina. It's just a real, again, testament to how important that work is of journalists and civil society. And we just wouldn't be here without it. And I should probably pass on to someone.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, Rebecca, please.
Sure. Actually, I'd like to start by thanking the Justice for Journalists Foundation for their kind support, which has been really valuable to Reporters Without Borders. It's allowed us to develop the report that I'll speak a bit about now, and also has supported our ability to do some of the advocacy that we've carried on, in particular at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and some of the research and advocacy travel to Malta as well. So there's actually shockingly little funding for this kind of work, and it has been really starting already to address a much needed gap. So Reporters Without Borders, of course, we focus on press freedom, and so that has been our angle in Malta from the start. So maybe just to walk it back a little for those who aren't as familiar with the case, I think when Daphne Caruana Galizia was assassinated in October 2017, it was shocking. From our bureau here in London, I think my phone was ringing off the hook for several days. I had not seen a case, and still haven't actually since our bureau has been open, that gained so much attention very quickly here with the British public. I think the fact that a journalist, the country's most prominent journalist, could be killed in broad daylight in an EU state was just unthinkable. And unfortunately, that really started a darker period in Europe. We saw further murders of journalists in EU states. We saw an increase in threats and attempted attacks against others. And that continues. But there are a number of things that we've only seen in Malta, and that has made this case unusual. It has made it emblematic in many ways, and it was one that just always stuck out to us. So we've really campaigned extensively on this, because we do feel that if we get somewhere, and I do believe we now are getting somewhere, that this will have a knock-on impact for our work throughout Europe and actually internationally. So it's never been a more dangerous time to be a journalist. The year that Daphne was killed, that we saw a deliberate increase in targeting of journalists outside of conflict zones. That trend has continued as well. And what really stuck out too was the degree of the impunity that continued. 3 murder suspects were arraigned just under 3 months, I think, after Daphne was killed, so in December 2017. Those 3 individuals have still not been brought to trial. One of them made it clear quite some time ago that he had information he was willing to share, and that lead has only recently begun to be pursued. I won't wade too much into that, because I know you guys have much more to say on the suspects and developments related to that. But then the investigation stalled. We certainly saw no outward progress. There were very clear deficiencies in the criminal investigation. The first couple of chapters of our report highlight that. And there was also a magisterial inquest that took place, that is still taking place in parallel in Malta. And we had concerns about police interference in some aspects of that as well. So those aspects necessitated a public inquiry. And that has been a key call of Daphne's family, of local and international civil society, and eventually of international institutions, primarily the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And I want to know, although now we still need the criminal investigation to be allowed to run its course, to follow the evidence where it leads, to continue unfettered and transparently, we still do need this public inquiry. It will establish bigger questions like what the state knew and should have known, if they could have acted to save Daphne's life, to prevent her assassination, and really importantly, what lessons can be drawn for the future. And that's a key point, because journalists who continue to pursue the sort of investigative reporting that Daphne did do so at great risk in Malta, until we actually understand fully what happened to her and why, and until everybody involved in this attack is brought to justice. There is that degree of risk. There are really only a handful of journalists even attempting this kind of work, and their dogged continued investigative reporting has actually been really crucial to the fight for justice, in addition to the sustained advocacy and campaigning as well. So our report also examines the broader press freedom climate. To do that properly, you also have to look at the history of how Daphne was treated and how her memory is treated posthumously. things that we haven't seen in other countries, continuous destruction of the protest memorial in Daphne's honor. At first, it was done sort of in the dead of night by perhaps overzealous volunteers, and then actually at some point the Minister of Justice gave orders for it to be cleared, and it continues to be cleared every night by the cleansing department of Valletta on government orders. We have not seen that even in much more hardened authoritarian states where journalists have been killed. It's very unusual. Also unusual is the continuation of defamation suits against Daphne posthumously. So at the time of her assassination, Daphne was facing 42 civil and 5 criminal defamation suits. And under Maltese law, on someone's death, the criminal suits automatically close. But it's up to the plaintiffs to decide whether to pursue the civil suits. And most did. Over time, some of them have dropped off. But at present, I believe there's still 26 civil suits.
26.
Still open. And this includes suits filed by the Prime Minister, by former Minister for Tourism Conrad Mitzi, by the Prime Minister's former Chief of Staff Kish Gambry, and as far as I know, despite recent developments, which I'll leave to you guys, those lawsuits continue, which begs some
I'm not
questions.
sure they'll turn up.
But no, it shows, it established a pattern. So if you look at this, it really shows a snapshot of the pressure that Daphne was facing at the time of her assassination. And it also shows that approach of those who wished to silence her. And although we still don't know exactly who did what, who was complicit in what, although we have a better idea now, we do know that certainly those in power, those very close to Joseph Muscat and Muscat himself, benefit from Daphne's inability to report on them now. And that is a line of questioning that the criminal investigation has failed to pursue, and that we hope a public inquiry will address. So the public inquiry is now finally proceeding, in fact, on Friday. And so we're coordinating with a big group of international NGOs to monitor that process. So watch this space. We'll share more on that soon. And I know your family will be very involved as well.
So the amazing, sorry to interrupt, the amazing thing about the public inquiry is that when we were writing the terms of reference or proposing them, we were very keen on this, classic human rights language about whether a state entity knew or ought to have known about any threats to her life. As it turns out, they did a bit more than actually know or not stand in its way. They were commissioners, but the public inquiry is a real and powerful thing, and it's really, we hope, a model of justice in these cases. And the terms of reference are publicly available. And as Rebecca said, it has started running, or will start next week.
That is purely a result of sustained and coordinated advocacy. This is not something that the Maltese authorities wanted, in fact, resisted quite actively. There's a whole chapter in our report on the public inquiry. There's another chapter on the international reaction so far, and that includes an overview of particularly what happened at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. They really crucially, firstly, there was the appointment of a special rapporteur tasked with looking into Daphne's assassination, Peter Omzicht, a Dutch MP who's been really strong, and the PACE Legal Affairs and Human Rights Committee has done excellent work, which resulted in a resolution and report in June that, among many other recommendations, set a 3-month window for the public inquiry to be established. And at no point over that 3 months was it clear that the Maltese government was going to comply until the very last minute. I think it was 6 days before the end on a Friday evening. Finally, an announcement came. And then there were a couple of months of negotiations with your family and authorities, and finally we've arrived at what we hope might actually yield some answers and some truth. So that progresses. The international reaction chapter of our report also covers other bodies that have examined what's happened in Malta, because of course this assassination didn't happen in a vacuum. Bodies including the European Parliament, the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe, Greco, which is a group of states against corruption, all have looked at Malta and found a really shocking systemic failure on many fronts. So we're talking not just about the press freedom climate, but about broader issues of rule of law, failure of democratic institutions. And we're seeing that now play out in real time, in particular the lack of checks and balances on the Prime Minister. So the failure of government to force him out at this point, it all goes back to that. So the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe has again now highlighted that the Maltese authorities have failed to implement any of the other recommendations of this really crucial June resolution. Only the public inquiry is moving moving forward. So that's really concerning. And just on the press freedom climate in particular, I wanted to say that Malta now has one of Europe's worst rankings. It's now 77th out of 180 countries in Reporters Without Borders World Press Freedom Index, having fallen 30 places since Daphne's assassination. And again, to underscore that there is still an active threat to journalists still working in the country. Our co-authors on the report, the Shift News, are a prime example of that. Caroline Muscat and the Shift News continue to face really awful attacks, both legal and otherwise, including SLAP lawsuits, strategic lawsuits against public participation, or we can think of those as abuse of defamation law, really intended to silence their public interest reporting. But very active threats that are continuing. We've been following interference with journalists who are attempting to cover the mass demonstrations that are ongoing. There was an assault of a woman journalist the other day. Paul was among a group of journalists locked in a room briefly after the cabinet meeting a few days ago.
Pretty minor event in the scheme of things.
But it's really, and it shows a really worrying attitude towards press freedom. So these issues need to be addressed. And I do believe now that the campaigning that has taken place is, again, the sustained, coordinated advocacy and campaigning among Paul's family, local civil society, international civil society, in parallel to this excellent investigative reporting that's continued, and a really brilliant legal case with the support of Doughty Street Chambers and Bob Murphy solicitors here in London. These things combined have actually resulted in what we're now seeing, and I believe that we are getting somewhere. That I've always said that I believe we can achieve justice in this case. I believe it now more than ever, and if we do, the impact that will have internationally will be remarkable, and this can be a model of how we can start to chip away at impunity everywhere.
Thank you.
Sorry if I was a bit long.
That's really powerful.
I suppose I can try to take you back to when John and I started speaking about writing a book about this story. But I find it personally very difficult to use the word story, because it is a story. It's gripping. It's complicated, but it almost feels now, I think, deceptively like it could even have a satisfying ending. So it's like, better than most stories, because stories from the real world, you should not expect, or should not look forward to a happy ending. But if you think there's a happy ending coming here, you haven't been paying attention. But if I were to rewind to 2 years ago, when the actual possibility of justice in this case looked so far and almost unlikely. The days and weeks after Daphne Caruana Galizia was killed, journalists from all over the world flew into Malta. Journalists flew into Malta usually because Malta was hosting a summit of some sorts. They take the family pictures. It's all pretty standard. It's all formulaic, and they leave after 12 hours. But this time journalists came to ask questions. Why was one of our own killed? Why was a journalist killed here? Most of them had not read much of what Daphne Caruana Galizia had written. They would not have known that she was a brilliant journalist, brilliant writer, and an incredible force of nature, and herself epoch-making in her writing, changed the course of Maltese history. But she was killed, and that was serious enough, so people come in, and the journalists flew into the country, and they asked, why was Daphne killed? And they found a rubber wall around the government offices. We've always guessed why. Now I think we can say we know why. They weren't getting any answers from that. Government refused to answer questions. They did make one exception, John Sweeney, who they said no to at first, but then they realized that maybe saying no to the BBC wasn't such a great idea, so they called him back in. And then they regretted it even more, but he'll tell you about that. But otherwise, they were not getting any answers from that. The local press corps was at first too shocked and maybe too small for this, because the thing about Daphne Caruana Galizia was that she was disproportionate for the size of the country. She was bigger than any newspaper in Malta. She was bigger than the country itself. And the rest of the media community in Malta struggled to understand, never mind explain, what had happened. So I found myself, and other journalists as well, having very long conversations, telling a very long story to try to explain to themselves before they explain to others why Daphne Caruana Galizia was killed and how was she killed and who killed her. And answering that short question with a long answer is how this book came about. So this book tries to go in the layers beneath the surface of there's a set of killers, there's a victim, they killed her, and who knows if they'll ever get their comeuppance. That's a superficial cover of the story. But underneath that story, there's Malta, a mafia state. That's a term that Paul's brother, in his first writing, I think less than 48 hours after he last saw his mother, wrote in a Facebook post, something like 80 words, 100 words, which we reproduce in the book. It was his first public statement, and it is incredible for anyone who's seen their mother die in that way, that he could write anything as clear, articulate, sharp, and analytical. But the thing about what he had written that day, 2 days after his mother was killed, was that he had diagnosed the causes of his mother's death. Maybe he suspected the killers of his mother's death, but the causes are a deeper question. And when we first saw written the words mafia state, I confess, but I think this was, the reaction of just about everyone. He's obviously going through a lot, and these are strong words, and maybe they're a little bit of the understandable exaggerations. But then we've spent the following 2 years really looking into this and understanding that a crime syndicate has taken over the reins on the governing of a country, making it to the rest of the world look like a country with all the trappings of diplomacy and of embassies and all the rest, and of visits with the Pope and European Council meetings and all of that. But actually what's happening is there's a private criminal activity going on, which is covered by this front. And the reason why this book has 3 authors is because I have taken the point of view of trying to answer what is happening in Malta, what has been happening in Malta, to explain this. John is asking the questions from outside. And those questions include, very importantly, the only real opportunity to ask the Prime Minister of Malta, the soon-to-be ex-Prime Minister of Malta, the real questions that needed to be asked. And the third author, who apologizes, couldn't be here, Carlo Bonini from Italy, because from him we got an understanding of what, if not what mafia state means, what mafia means. And mafia is not in the business of killing people. Mafia hates violence. Violence is not good for business. But when it needs to survive, it will kill. And this is what we have experienced. And the funny thing is, the book starts with, it's headlined with a metaphor, a literary reference to Agatha Christie. You imagine being Poirot standing on a train and you're looking at the characters, including Jorgen Fenech, including Joseph Muscat, but Konrad Mitzi, other characters in this that are now just coming down like flies because the cement that bound them, which was mutual reciprocated blackmail, is now cracking and they're falling apart. And yes, it is of some satisfaction to see the culprits fall apart. But the fact of the matter is, this is a mafia state. The mafia right now is fighting to survive. The mafia is fighting to choose the next prime minister to follow this one. So I think the killers of Daphne are going to face justice. The people who stole this country, well, that's going to be a tougher job. This is bittersweet. So we hope that with this book, we've put you in a position to understand where we are now, but not to be satisfied with this ending. I sincerely wish justice for Daphne and for Daphne's family, And that's a big win that mostly journalism, civil society, and the family's leadership and that has achieved. But so we asked for two things when Daphne was killed. We asked for truth and we asked for justice. I think we have a good understanding of the truth. And if we keep at it, I think we're going to get justice. But if you think that's it, you haven't read the book yet, because it's pretty grim.
John.
Prime Minister Joseph Muscat, if you're listening or if you're watching, resign. Resign now. I never met Daphne Caruana Galizia, but she was amazing. Like an arrow in the blue. She was fantastic. And there were times when Carlo and Manuel and I, we met in Alleghe in the Dolomites this summer. And we sat round the table, all of us knocking out chapters. And every now and then, one of us would go, wow. And following in the footsteps of her courage was one of the most amazing this is a strange thing to say about somebody who was so brutally blown up, but wonderful things I've ever done in my life. She was so fucking brave and so good and so on the money. I've left the BBC so I can swear. She was, I can swear like a trooper, but she was great. And part of the reason why we're here now, reading the headlines coming from Malta, is the courage of her sons and the family, but the sons and the family for sticking with it. I went to North Korea once and I wrote a book about it, and we ended up interviewing an Italian communist who went to North Korea, and he was a Euro communist, he was a decent human being, and he said to the North Koreans, why are you so awful on human rights? And he said it was like pissing on marble. And I certainly felt, and certainly a year after Daphne was assassinated, I felt like all of us were pissing on marble. It just so happens that if enough of us piss on marble, it starts to crack. And what's so beautiful about what's happening at the moment is the rats are ratting on each other again and again and again, and soon I hope justice will be done. But, Prime Minister, I repeat myself, you may not have been listening the first time. Prime Minister Joseph Muscat, the artful dodger of Europe, resign and do that now. Because at the moment you are impeding justice, you are impeding the rule of law, and you are creating further shame for you and your country. And Malta's a beautiful place, but this, somebody said, it was Daphne's sister, Caruana, said it was a joke, but also it wasn't a funny one. This is welcome to Malta, welcome to North Korea with palm trees. And what Joseph Muscat and his gang have done they have ended up ruining this place. But this is important, not just the story we tell in the book. It's not just a story about Malta, about a tragedy for one family, or a tragedy for a beautiful island in the middle of the Mediterranean. It's a tragedy of our time, because dirty money is hollowing out our democracies around Europe, around the world, and dirty money is doing its thing. And so it's great that Mikhail Khodorkovsky has managed, once he got out of the nick, to set up the Justice for Journalism Fund, which helped us write this book. By the way, let's remember that no big British or American publisher would publish this book. So the way it got written was because of the fund funded us to write it. And then we're sat round, and then there's this moment where we think, how are we going to legal this book? We're going to get it legaled in Malta, yeah, but how are we going to get it legaled in London? And it's virtually pointless. By the way, in the room right now is Carol Cadwallader, who spent the day in court facing Aaron Banks. Now, I've left the BBC so I can say what I think about Aaron Banks. Missed Mr. Banks, you have snow in your boots, some people say. We have a problem in that we, too often, journalists like us, come across dirty money. Rather too much of this dirty money comes from Russia. But what happened in Malta was that you had a sewer of dirty money coming from all around the world, some of it from Gaddafi's goons in Libya, some of it from China. There was a corrupt Vietnamese MP, and lots of Russians buying passports for a wonderful company called Henley and Partners. By the way, sorry, I haven't said this, all concerned deny any wrongdoing. But
even as they burn.
Yeah. Now, all concerned deny any wrongdoing. And this, well, all concerned deny any wrongdoing. That's what they say. I'm glad to hear it. But what are we doing here? How can you buy passports? How can you set up a bank, Pilatus Bank, set up by an Iranian? It would look like money laundering, and lo and behold, and I got a fancy letter from Schillings, which is a fancy law firm, and lo and behold, the FBI busted the owner of the bank, and the bank's been closed down. My favourite bit of the book is the last chapter, and it's called All Concerned Deny Any Wrongdoing. And Manuel, who looks like a gent, but he has a little devil inside him. And the little devil kept on writing annoying reply letters back to Jürgen Fennick's lawyers. And there's like, did you, why? So one of the alleged killers, they deny it, one of the alleged killers gambled in your casino, Mr. Jürgen Fennick, and he came away with 441,000 euros in clean money. By the way, somebody smart worked that out and said it was like 96% success rate in the casino. Now, I don't like gambling, but
you would like it if you were so lucky.
Yeah, 96%. This was years before. This is evidence about a money laundering case, all concerned in any wrongdoing. This was years before the murder, but there's an evidence of an association. So just to be clear, Mr. Jürgen Fennick, his lawyers, blah, 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 are you quite sure? You weren't suspicious. This man was unemployed. How come he got so much money? Did you register it? And then Manuel went on and on and on. We pissed on the marble, and the marble cracked. So then we write a letter to the Prime Minister, his wife. I'm sorry, I'm not sexist. The Prime Minister, a woman who Daphne alleged had received $1 million bung from the fabulously corrupt regime in Azerbaijan. All concerned deny any wrongdoing. This woman so happens to be the Prime Minister's wife. Chris Cardona, the man who went to a brothel in Germany when he was on business in the economics conference, he denied it. Daphne, he sued Daphne. Daphne wanted to see his phone records. He dropped the case. So the evidence stands that that's what he did. We wrote to Konrad Mitzi and we wrote to Keith Chandry. We got a letter from Carter Fuck. I pronounce it correctly, and Carter Fuck denies everything. And again, we're in the position of writers of a book saying, right, where do we go with this? And we just go, right, we're publishing it, we're getting it out there. And it was a thing of beauty. Now, this year I left the BBC under difficult circumstances, and it was bad. And writing this book has been a real therapy for me, a real tonic. It was, as I said, it was an honour to follow in Daphne's footsteps, along with all the other great journalists, Stephen Gray, the people from the Daphne Project, our wonderful colleagues from around the world, and others, Peter Omzicht's Reporters Without Frontiers, the others too, thumping away, pissing away on the marble. It was wonderful. But there was this moment when one of Tommy Robinson's supporters said, "You're finished, your career's over, you're dead, mate, you're dead, you're finished." And then I was able to reply on Twitter, thank you very much for that. Variety magazine are reporting today that there's a Hollywood company that's making a TV series of our book. Meryl Streep, if you want the part, it's yours, frankly. That's as far. But this was an exciting moment. So, what happened 2 years and a bit ago was a terrible and monstrous crime. The government of Malta, from its Prime Minister down, tried to cover up that crime, and they are now afraid. Prime Minister, resign. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bravo.
Thank you very much, everyone. What a phenomenal panel we've got today. I would like to open the floor for questions now, and I would kindly ask you to raise your hand. We have a microphone just there, and if you have a question, and I've got a microphone, stand up, say your name, and ask your question, and say to whom you ask your question. Thank you very much. Please, if any questions are there in the panel. Yes, the gentleman just there, please. Yeah, yeah. Please use the microphone. Thank you.
Ted Sullivan. I just wanted to ask. I've spoken to Rebecca and just laterally to John about the legal sort of situation that allows libel actions to be brought. In the case of someone dying, which is not an international norm as far as I know. I'm just wondering if part of the byproduct of what can be achieved here is that somehow the restrictive laws that have been exercised in this case in Malta can be changed, and whether the European Union can exercise some way of kind of in a sense supporting press freedom by kind of trying to make libel laws have a certain uniformity within the EU. I'll ask it to anybody who can answer it, really.
So in Malta, the legal reasoning is that a plaintiff can continue seeking damages against someone's estate, which is what allows the suit to continue. So in effect, the Prime Minister, Keith Schembri, are seeking damages against my mother's estate. In practice, that's us. In practice, it's my father who has to take the witness stand every time he's called. Obviously, there are huge issues. It's besides being inhumane, your primary witness isn't available, so we are somehow expected to know who my mother's sources were, what they told her. There has been one change in Malta where, after my mother was killed, the government repealed criminal libel. They no longer had any use for it. It was only really ever used against her. Whether there'll be more change, I don't know. I know Rebecca is at the front of, and Sarah, of an anti-SLAPP campaign, and I don't know if you, yeah.
Well, I could pick up the issue of passing to heirs quickly. Actually, that is not in accordance with international best practices, and it's a step that the Human Rights Commissioner of the Council of Europe has called for not just these suits to be dropped, but actually that the legal provisions that allow for the passing of suits to heirs to be repealed, which we as NGOs have also called for. So we continue to press for that. But SLAPP is the bigger issue, and I think Malta has served as a really interesting case study in that we now know internationally more about SLAPP because of the things that have happened in Malta than we did previously, particularly as a press freedom issue. And that's because it's kind of been an open secret. Like, many in the industry internationally have known that this is a practice that's been exercised very often by the same few London law firms, I have to say, that affect countries around the world, including one that has been aptly pronounced just prior. But actually, most media and most journalists aren't really talking about instances where they're receiving these threats. Most media, even here in the UK, big media outlets will simply comply, and it's very hard for us to research and to actually find examples of this to campaign on. Now, we know in Malta what happened because Daphne refused to comply. She published these threats. Caroline Muscat of the Shift News continues to do the same. That's very courageous. And now we're starting to identify more cases of this. John mentioned that Carol's here. I was in the courtroom earlier today. It takes courage even here in London to sit there and to challenge the Aaron Bankses of this world. But it's so important to challenge these cases, because until we can start to really get a picture of this kind of pressure and to counter it, it will continue to be used to silence public interest reporting. And so it's really critical. And I think our colleague Sarah Clark from Article 19 is here and has worked heavily on this aspect as well, so she might have something to add.
Hi, and thanks. Just on the EU aspect, I think thanks to the work of Daphne's family in particular, but also a much larger group of journalists at the Brussels level, there's been a huge push for an anti-SLAPP directive, and we now have a commitment from Vera Jourova, the commissioner who was formerly on justice, now on transparency, that the EU is going to open up its directives as they pertain to interjurisdictional cases, so where you have it between countries. What we're also pushing for is that national levels, so slaps that are taken domestically, that they are also addressed. What's really tricky is that the UK is obviously leaving the EU, so that directive will not apply.
By the way, that's not a fact. There is a general election going on.
There is. So let's say the UK, for example, leaves the EU. What actually we are now going to see is a very interesting legal issue where basically the High Court decisions that are taken here in London will not have application in any other EU state, which is great. So hopefully the UK will not leave and the directive will apply across the board. If the UK does leave, it's very good news for the rest of the EU, because the likes of the London law firms here that are taking these cases before the London High Court, those decisions will no longer have application. So that's one upside for the rest of the EU. So
It will still be said.
Thank you, sir.
But by the way, I forgot to say that Scientology also, the Carter Fuck also works with Scientology. The Space Alien Cult, the government of Malta. What's the difference? Sorry, I shouldn't say that.
More questions, please. Yes, please, the gentleman there.
Yeah, was Michon de Rea one of those firms, and the chairman of Penn, perhaps, involved in any of these cases?
Well, I'm glad.
John, if you have any opinions.
Yes, they were. So Mishcon, acting on behalf of Henley and Partners, the passport firm, sent a number of really aggressive, really threatening legal letters to my mother about her reporting on the firm. And of course they all threaten action in the court here, in England and Wales. They always say it. Obviously there's no real jurisdiction, but they all threaten it. The other significant firm is Schillings, who Manuel and John can talk more about, but very quickly actually, since you mentioned it, on English Pen. So Anthony Julius is on the board of English Pen and is, the chair of their defamation practice, I think, or just the deputy chair of the whole firm, if I remember well. And so we had this extraordinary meeting with the trustees of English Pen where we said, this is nuts. It's like having the CEO of BP on the board of Greenpeace. It just doesn't make sense. And, they met with us, with a number of other journalists and editors and lawyers who work for papers, and in the end decided to keep Julius on the board. And he released this really, I think, interesting statement where he said, I continue to defend English Pen. But there you are. So there was this really, actually one of the most egregious abuses of libel law in Malta happened when a number of these firms, Schillings, most notably, and a minor American law firm, literally shut down almost completely the reporting on the bank Manuel mentioned, Pilatus, which my mother had reported on. And the crazy thing is, we didn't even know. So these firms sent letters, really threatening letters, to every media house in the country. And because those threats were so big, so they threatened massive damages that a Maltese media house could never afford, they just caved. And they did that without even telling their readers that, look, we're removing this article. In some cases, they didn't remove the articles, they edited them without any notice. So we only learned that this was happening after my mother was killed. So my mother was reporting freely on this bank, and she kept asking, why aren't the papers picking it up? And then, weeks after she was killed, we discovered that these firms had threatened one by one every media house. in the dark, and they were too scared, obviously, to publish those threats. So we never knew.
The episode that Paul was speaking about, the letters about on behalf of Henley and Partners, they feature in our book, and I think it's one of those the responses that Daphne publishes that we say, that you were talking about, John, before, that simply take your breath away. I mean,
these scamming crooks, Henley and Partners.
The way
she said,
she ignored the lawyers and wrote to their clients, to Henley and Partners, in a way that you wish you were born with that sort of courage and audacity and determination, because it's exemplary, and it is the refusal to be intimidated. There's something else to it, to how successful Pilatus Bank was with anyone else, all the other news organizations, to pull these stories, entire interviews with whistleblowers from inside, the whistleblower from inside the bank. They were pulled. They didn't bother to speak to your mother. They filed the $40 million lawsuit in Arizona, which she never found out about, because it was hopeless asking her to. I mean, there was no threat that would have made her. But everyone else did. Everyone else backed down, and you have to try to imagine the danger for the source, for the whistleblower, who voluntarily outed herself when she saw the overwhelming pressure on Daphne with that story. So she stepped up and she said, listen, the unnamed source is me. A public lynching process happened. She had to run away from the country, live in hiding where they tried to smoke her out. And the best, most effective way to discredit the whistleblower was to intimidate the news organizations so that they would remove their interviews and their quotes from her. Because all of a sudden, when the journalists chickened out and backed out, the source became a liar, because her words were no longer worth staying on the newspaper. And it is incredible that this pressure literally attempted to rewrite history in the most 1984 way you can imagine, because obviously what was printed was still there, but that was just in the library. But if you went back to search it online, as all of us would do, what was said at that time, you wouldn't find it. Then, when Pilatus Bank fell because the FBI intervened, because American laws were broken, because its owner was arrested there, then all newspaper felt bold again, and truth resurfaced, because obviously the lawyers no longer had a client.
Henley and Partners has a kind of pot of money which it gives to friendly journalists to buy their acquiescence. And there was a moment in April 2018, some months after Daphne had been assassinated, where there was an event. Paul was there on the outside. It was cold, and the Prime Minister of Malta arrived, Joseph Muscat, and I tried to doorstep him. Prime Minister, do you stand by Chris Cardona, your brothel creeping minister or something like that? I was at my diplomatic best, and I got thumped by one of Mr. Muscat's security team. This assault was caught not only by BBC's cameras, but also by Reuters. And you saw it as well.
I saw it, yeah.
I was thumped. Now, there are a lot of people in this room who say, that's okay. But, and they're all my friends and family. But it wasn't okay, and I think the BBC should have reported that one of its reporters was thumped by the Prime Minister of Malta's security team. That should have happened, and we should have done a film, and the working title of that film, a follow-up film, was called Malta's Disgrace. There was a problem, and the problem was this, was a BBC colleague, BBC presenter for the Today programme, Justin Webb, had been in the Henley and Partners event earlier that day, and he'd been doing a corporate gig for Henley and Partners. For whatever reason, and I don't know for a fact, but for whatever reason, our film, Malta's Disgrace, was never shown, and Justin Webb is still presenting the Today programme, and I'm at a job centre. I'm happier that it's this way round. Anybody who takes any money, any journalist who takes money from Henley and Partners isn't a journalist anymore. They're a smooth-sayer for a dirty, rotten bunch of scamming crooks, all concerned deny any wrongdoing.
Of course. Even as deep.
Can I just pick up, because we've mentioned Chris Cardona several times, but one of the oddities of the last couple of weeks that we haven't mentioned is that he self-suspended at some point in this, and it was reported as one of the resignations, and a week later was very easily reinstated, which wasn't shocking to many.
Reinstated,
but some did. So as far as we could tell, there was never any legal basis for self-suspension. But I highlight that only because things are very quickly developing in the country, and some of it is being very excellently reported in the country in a very nuanced way, whereas the international reporting doesn't always capture that nuance. And I just want to highlight that that's really important when looking at Malta. Things are not often as they seem. And so immediately the headlines a couple of weeks ago was the mastermind has been caught. Over the weekend, it was Joseph Muscat has resigned. Like, those things are not actually categorically true. And so I just want to state that. And I know, you know, it's hard, especially for journalists who are not based in the country, to capture that. But often, internationally, people will just glance at headlines. And so if it's just reported as a done deal that Muscat has resigned, then there's not then that scrutiny that actually might be needed to see that through. So as it stands, we don't actually have a clear indication that he will. What we have is a date that they intend to hold a election for the Labour Party leadership. That is it. And the more cynical parts of my mind after 2 years closely looking at this country is that possibly once, you know, if the protests die down, if the international media coverage dies down, possibly that doesn't happen at all. So I would just highlight that really the local context is really necessary to understand, and there is nuance. And I think there is some really excellent reporting coming from the country at the moment, and perhaps that should be a bit more central, not just the international.
Because what's happening right now, and I think it's worth saying. I mean, you saw my wife passed me the phone just because news is, you know, progressing every half an hour. It's
what's the latest?
Dramatic time. I'll tell you what the latest is, but I need to give you just background of the last 12 hours. The alleged middleman who's been pardoned completely in order to testify testifies that Keith Kembry, the former chief of staff of the Prime Minister, did not commission him to do this murder. However, in the same testimony, he makes a list of links that he's had with the chief of staff of the Prime Minister. One of them is, now this guy is a loan shark. He owns
the advisor or the
no, the taxi driver. Okay, so he has a taxi business. He's a loan shark. He has a second-hand car dealership. He's a wheeler dealer.
Nothing wrong with that.
No, he's a wheeler dealer. No, the second-hand car dealership is probably the worst one, right? So he's a wheeler dealer, and he's making money on his own, etc., etc. But one thing he says is that the chief of staff of the Prime Minister gave him a public sector job, because why? And the painful thing is that it looks like part of the way the chief of staff of the Prime Minister might have paid for this murder to happen is actually used, you know, taxpayers' money to pay for it. I mean, it's one thing to be an assassin, but to be a stingy one is another level of evil. He did that so callously, and the witness testifies it in court, and the chief civil servant comes out and says, listen, we've looked at the record and the name Melvin Teuma doesn't come up. You know, if we employ someone, we'd know. Except that someone then went to look inside the employment corporation and found indeed that the record was there. So by the end of the day, the principal permanent secretary, the principal civil servant says, actually we did find the record, he did really work for the government. It's a situation now where the cover-up attempts are becoming so bungling, so ridiculous, that these are becoming, I think the word we used was panto villains, right? They're clumsily, they're to the point of being ridiculous. But the more we find out of this, the more we realize that as you spent 2 years fighting for justice for your mother, mocked for it, lampooned, cartooned, accused of hating your country more than wanting justice for your mother. As that was happening, these people were sipping tea, congratulating each other for getting away with murder, literally. And there's no sweetness in this revenge. There's no satisfaction in this, because tomorrow we'll find out just another way, another stupid, callous, cruel way with which they went about covering their tracks. And their tracks are just, showing them up now.
One thing though, this wasn't a stingy assassination. What the message to pay the middleman who commissioned the murderers they denied. This is the state has your back. This is a state-sanctioned murder, and you're on the payroll. That's the shame of it.
Thank you. Let's see whether we have more questions. Yes, please. Yes, Carol.
Hello.
Stand up, Carol. Stand up, Carol. And everybody give her a bloody round.
Don't do that. It's really not about me. But thank you so much, and thank you, Rebecca, for coming to court today and supporting me. That was actually really appreciated. And I just wanted to say as well, because Daphne's approach to dealing with these legal letters did quite inspire me. I think I've talked to you about it before, because they are scary when you get them and you think you have to reply very formally. And when I read your mother's blog and saw her saying, "Oh, don't be so ridiculous. This is such a ridiculous threat," and responding in that way, it did make me think, actually, you can do a bit of that as a lone. That is the power of being an individual rather than a company or a news organisation. But the thing I wanted to say, to respond to of what you were saying about these law firms, is that I really do think that we need some sort of campaign around naming and shaming. It is just not acceptable, this thing about these 26 outstanding suits. And these are highly respectable law firms doing business with highly respectable companies, and this is not a respectable trade. And I do think that we've kind of, we need to get that over much more strongly. And it does work, because although Mishcon de Rea is still working with Henley, they did actually sack Aaron Banks. So there is. There
are some people who are so scummy.
Yeah. So anyhow, that was all I wanted to say, and I kind of think that is a pressure point that might be worth pressing on. Sorry, and that was a kind of a statement rather than a question. But maybe you can say, John, in terms of publishing, and Manuel, in terms of publishing the book, was there a lot you had to leave out because of the legal threats?
Not a word. Well, the one thing we did. Do you want to tell the story?
Which one?
The paraphrasing of the Carter fuck letter.
Oh yes. Yeah. Yes, because after sending us an exquisitely polite, almost painfully polite letter, Carter rock or fuck, whichever it is. Also covered it with, this is not for publication, this is confidential. And we had this 20 seconds of doubt about whether we should publish something which was indicated not for publication. So we found the formula of respecting it by putting the whole letter in indirect speech, including Carter Fuck says, "Yours sincerely, Carter Fuck." But I don't mean to suggest that we weren't scared for a while. It really was a bit of a leap of faith, and we sort of tested it out. The book has been published before, so this is sort of like the international edition of the book that we're launching here today, and it's been out in Malta for a few weeks. And a local publisher said, hell with these bastards, I'm going to do it. And really, that's what it is about. What it is about is, we're right, they're wrong. I have the advantage over Carlo and John that I don't have a house they can take away from me. So there it is. So when you have nothing, it's easier, I suppose.
Now you tell me.
But one thing about this, one lesson about this, and you hit it right there. Daphne comes from newspapers, from the newspaper world. She was bigger than local newspapers from her very first day. When she started writing, opinion columns in Malta weren't signed. Daphne on Sunday was the first ever branded column in Malta. They had to change that because her writing was so distinctive, so irreverent, that it came with the name. But there came a point where something she was extremely snotty about, blogging. She realized in 2008 that what she wanted to write, at the speed she wanted to write with it, and the speed with which your company lawyers will never catch up with you, why this needs to be said, could never be measured with a newspaper cycle anymore. And this is why she became the one-woman WikiLeaks, because only that could give her the space. Now that has problems as well, because we all need peer review, we all need to be slowed down sometimes. We all write things that we might regret, and maybe someone else telling us to slow down is not a bad idea. But she was liberated by her blog. And she could afford to be courageous because, to hell with it, I'm right, I'm going to do that. And this is what we try to do here. If we were going to let them take away a chapter from us, and you'll see in the last chapter, Jürgen Fenech certainly tried. And now, you look at him and you'll say, well, that is, okay, so this is the one. And now seeing Jürgen Fenech being chased down back from his yacht, that's for a journalist, that's satisfying. This has been a battle journalists have fought. We haven't won it, but journalists have. We could see, and it's rare, journalism actually making a difference and turning history around. And that's nice. That bit is nice.
Just quickly on the letter, I should say we had a lawyer at home, my father, who
of course he came with the deal.
But on the yes, it comes in handy. But the best piece of advice I remember he gave my mother is that every time you see a letter that's marked private and confidential, that's really up to you, and I can't bear that they keep using it. The moment that letter is stamped and sent, it's your property. You can throw it away, you can publish it, you can use it to wipe your windscreen. And it can't keep working, that private and confidential thing. It's total shit.
And here's what we're finding. Actually, sometimes you can call their bluff. Sometimes, in fact, often I think they don't actually intend to see this through. Caroline Muscat has taken that approach. She's been publishing everything marked private and confidential. And so far, none of those suits on, intimidating London legal letterhead have actually resulted in an actual lawsuit. Okay, that's clearly not always the case. Sometimes people will see it through. But I think that's one thing about SLAP. One reason it is so effective is because they're counting on that intimidation factor being a low-cost solution for them in silencing public interest reporting or activism or whatever, because this is not just an issue with journalism, that's our focus. But I think one of the most effective ways that we can really counter this will be greater solidarity of the media and the free expression community together. And I've done some research in Malta as to how things went down, and when you speak individually to the media outlets that ended up complying with these threatening letters, they were watching each other, and particularly when the bigger outlets folded, the smaller ones were then left in a position where they were afraid. But if they had all challenged it, they would have all been in a stronger position, right? And so that's why we need those sort of pioneering people. And I know, none of us can judge what somebody else would do if their mortgage and their personal finances are really on the line like that. But I think that's how we start to chip away at this. And I agree with you, Carol, as well, from a campaigning perspective, greater naming and shaming of the law firms that are so frequently engaging in these practices and effectively silencing independent media all over the world. And that's why we need to talk more about SLAP and what it is. I think it's been lawyers, mostly American lawyers, for many years kind of talking about it. And so we kind of have been trying to explain more what it is, what it's about. We don't have to use the term SLAP, but it is useful shorthand for what it is, just so the public is aware that these things are happening. Not, and including here in London too, not just in countries like Malta.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Yes, the gentleman in the back there. So.
Hi. The European Union heads of states will probably meet in January to discuss Brexit or something of the sort. Do you think that anybody from the current Maltese government is actually welcome at that table, with the reception that they will get?
It's because actually journalism is half my time, the other half is activism. And we've had that conversation yesterday, my wife and I, with a delegation from the European Parliament, cross-party delegation. And it's really a matter of concern because the governance of the European Union includes heads of government of member states. And protocol dictates that Joseph Muscat will stand around the table and there'll be the photo opportunity and someone who's reasonably suspected of covering up murder and reasonably suspected of worse is going to stand around the table. So yes, it's a matter of great concern, and Malta remains a sovereign country, and no other government can fire your prime minister. It's your job and your responsibility to remove, as citizens of Malta, it's our job to remove the prime minister. Now, the prime minister is determined not to go, and there's a reason for that. It's clear. At face value, it's reputation laundry, including the meeting at the European Council on the 15th of December. The Pope is seeing him on the 7th of December. There will be nice family pictures with the children. So yes, there is reputational laundry, but there's something more sinister at play, which is the mafia is choosing Malta's next prime minister. And his last task on the job is helping that happen. So he can't do much for them anymore, but he can do that. And it's profoundly disturbing that the only people in Malta that can fire a prime minister, in reality, is his own parliamentary group, his own parliamentary party. They're the only one with the constitutional power to do it. Malta's president is the equivalent of your queen. The constitution is taken down from your system. So it would be as unimaginable. I mean, I would imagine the president is giving him a good talking to, but if it doesn't go, it doesn't go. The only people who can fire him are his parliamentarians. But the same gun is pointed to their heads. They have given him enabling powers in a resolution that they've passed last Sunday, which remind you of Nuremberg. I mean, it's something unbelievable. When a prime minister has presided over an office that has covered up a murder, and they tell him not only that they enjoy full confidence in him, which can be withdrawn at any time, but that they give him a blank check on deciding his own fate from here on. That's just Parliament surrendering to an executive which is run by a tyrant who's willing to cover up, the murder of people who have stopped him or sought to. So it's a very worrying time, and it's a very worrying time for Europe, because this is a clear weakness in the governance of Europe, because it assumes, like our own constitution does internally, that you have decent people, by and large, running the show. Now, you'll have corruption. It will happen. It will happen in Malta, it will happen in Sweden, it will happen. But I think we should agree that we can draw the line at murder. And this is a serious European problem. And yes, we'll be watching it on television if the Prime Minister has his way, on the 15th of December.
Thank you. Yes, gentleman here. Valeria. Just there. Just.
So I'm Maltese myself, born and raised over there, and the whole situation makes me, deeply saddened. It's horrendous, essentially. So hypothetically speaking, once the crooks are flushed out, essentially, and justice is served, how can Malta and the Maltese people actually fix this? To avoid this happening once again, because it's happened in the past before.
So the public inquiry that we mentioned earlier, we conceived really as a way of addressing exactly those issues. We, at the time we started campaigning for it, had our own views about whether we'll get justice for our mother, and we thought, at least let's try and do this. At least let's try and get the government to meet one of its legal obligations and convene a public inquiry. And I really encourage you to look at it and look at the terms of reference and see how far-reaching they are and how much power the board has. And if that's run properly, then we should see institutional reform, and we should see not just the people who have immediate criminal culpability for her murder, but all the people who failed. They should face justice as well. Yes, it is about time, I think.
But if I can say, if I can, ring a sadder note to that. One of the incredible miracles these guys have achieved, working at the Council of Europe, is that they sat people down and they made them look at Malta at a level deeper than the superficial. They asked themselves, why did this happen? And they found institutional failures. They found a situation where Malta has had a constitution since 1964, designed by a colonist that wanted to look like they're being democratic about it, but actually wanted to retain control in the center place. So our prime ministers inherited that controlling power. We had a series of relatively decent prime ministers, at least most of them stopped at murder, short of murder, and then we didn't anymore. So the institutional challenges brought to us by the Council of Europe and so on, have been on the record for a couple of years, but the unwillingness of the government to confront them, playing with time and so on and so forth, means that they have remained on paper. Now, after the present crisis, I suppose it's good to look forward to institutional reform. But there's an even deeper layer. We can't blame this on the British colonists. No, not completely. There's a cultural layer. Daphne once...
Thank God for that.
Yes, okay, so it's not all your fault. Daphne once wrote, listen, there's corruption everywhere, at every level. You'll find it. What is particular about Malta is that the attitude to corruption is corrupt. Okay, that money laundering is not a crime; it's being smart. It is somehow refreshing to see that when Jürgen Fenech was arrested, the penny dropped, even for supporters of the government, because people will draw the line at blood on the floor. It did. Malta is not desensitized to murder, but it's certainly desensitized to the dirty money, or to the dirt in the money that fuels the economy, that keeps people happy, and that people don't want to see go away. So the connection from Daphne's killing to the people who killed her, people are making, and they're angry about it. But the connection between Daphne's killing, through the people who killed her, through what those people were protecting, which is the dirty money that flows to the country, well, that connection has been made yet. That is a cultural revolution. One way of preventing that cultural revolution from happening is another cultural aspect of Malta, that everything comes in twos. So the tribalism, the partisanship, the idea that any criticism must be motivated in the other party gaining advantage. We need to graduate from that. And no independent inquiry can help us fix that. We need to come to terms with what has happened to us. So as journalists, our duty internally in Malta is to tell the story, is to explain it, is to try to show it. But we live in a country where the two political parties own all the television stations between them. So there's no investigative reporting happening there. You need to buy the book. And how's that for a second-hand car sales?
Yeah.
I would probably, before we switch to buying the book, I would give two more questions, opportunity to ask two more questions. I think, Sarah, let's start with you, because I think you've already asked your questions once. Valerie, would you want? Just here. Yeah, that's great. Just here. Thank you.
It's just about the public inquiry. Again, it's starting on Friday at 9 o'clock. And today our organisations, RSF and Article 19 and a group of us have really made a plea to journalists and diplomats and intergovernmental organisations to monitor it and to monitor it very closely. So as Paul said, the terms of reference are excellent. The board, there is a lot of trust in the board. However, we know the level of political and executive interference in all of the processes at the moment. There are going to be big problems, challenges around disclosure of evidence, around full participation in the inquiry. So I can't stress enough how important it is that the press and diplomats and all of us are watching for the next 9 months, 3 times a week. So please do come, please do report on it, because you know the significance of it, but we can't just leave it now that it's been achieved. It's the monitoring aspect is incredibly important. Thank you.
It also may interest this room that the inspiration for it came from Russia, actually. And when we were speaking to someone on the Sergei Magnitsky campaign for justice, they told us, you need to go to the Council of Europe and you need to call for a special rapporteur. And I don't know what Matthew and Andrew were thinking, but I thought, what the hell is a special rapporteur? Anyway, so on a train to Strasbourg, we were drafting this motion for a special rapporteur, and the inspiration came from the Boris Nemtsov special rapporteur motion. And if you look at them, you'll see they're quite similar. And I remember thinking, what a thing, here we are on this train writing this motion, and it's based on Boris Nemtsov. And in fact, the special Peter Omzik is now one of 3 special rapporteurs that the Council of Europe has ever assigned to a murder.
Into individual cases. There's been thematic and country-specific.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's Nemtsov, Magnitsky, and my mother.
And just to add to what Paul and Sarah have said, we need absolutely scrutiny and support to that process in the country, but also to the ongoing attempts of PACE to hold the authorities to account. So this government, however many of them may last, has worked to really to attack Peter Omzik. I mean, ad hominem attacks. This is a common tactic of this. Do I use the word regime with Malta? I think we do, actually. And to undermine the work of his committee and PACE, and focus more on trying to say that they're cooperating with the Council of Europe because they're speaking to the Office of the Secretary General, and that is not enough. So the PACE Legal Affairs Committee has really pulled together a broader, as I mentioned earlier, excellent set of recommendations, and that really deserves scrutiny. They're going to attempt to hold the government to account for all of those recommendations, and one step that we as NGOs are calling for in that regard is reconsideration of bringing Malta under country monitoring, which is a step that the government is resisting, but we think is really needed given this rule of law crisis in the country.
Thank you. Right. So do you want to ask a question?
Well,
yeah.
Sorry, just verifying the question.
Right.
Just in terms of the chilling effect of having 1,000 bots or prominent right-wing figures such as Stephen Yaxley Lennon, the failed mortgage broker, on your case, and Carol, obviously you've had this a lot as well. I mean, how chilling is that in terms of affecting publication or journalism, or are you going about your business having that kind of sort of scrutiny and pressure from fake news merchants or the right wing or various bots, etc., on your case?
It's depressing and it gets you down. When I did this film event, I tried to make a panorama about Tommy Robinson's and actually Lennon, and I was attacked very much by his supporters online, but also in person on the streets of London. And while leaving Lyra McKee's funeral in Belfast, I was challenged by one of his supporters, and I found that bewildering. You get it in Malta. Yes. Your family gets it in Malta. Paul and his brothers was accused of murdering his mother by a man. I've seen this man. There is, I mean, so there is a real problem with social media, as much as there is a problem with some newspapers, some politicians. An unregulated social media is, I think, the worst thing and the most frightening thing. And for a time, I found it. I cracked up a little bit under this pressure. Weirdly. The discipline of writing this book on Daphne was the thing that put me back together again, and I want to thank Daphne, who is even now saying, John, I think you want to go to the pub, don't you? Because she was a good woman and she was wise. But I feel that we've got to address this. We've got to address the lawlessness of social media, and the possibility that there are Russian bots or criminal bots or whatever who are coming at us, who I'm loosely going to describe very loosely as the truth tellers. And at one level you've got real letters from Calder Ruck, Schillings, Pishcon, the Rare, whatever it's called. And then on another level, you've got these people threatening you online. For me, it was the online stuff was worse.
I think, yeah, the really frightening thing about Malta is the bots are real people. They're not sort of Kremlin bots. They're real people, and often not afraid of using their own real identities. And I don't know, some of the stuff is wild, you know, like the conspiracy theory that we had a hand in our own mother's assassination. And it was not a French thing. It was being pushed by the Prime Minister's office. And that's, you know, it's still happening. It's still happening even now. And you know, Facebook in particular has a lot to answer for in Malta. I mean, there are some groups which Caroline Muscat at The Shift has reported on, which are real cesspits. And I mean, I've never had to face up to just how bad it's become in Malta and how freely people talk about these crazy conspiracy theories.
And with government involvement, with the involvement of state officials in many of these online hate groups, including one that the Prime Minister's Facebook account joined for some time.
And I mean, I'd feel a lot better if someone told me, actually, this is a troll army run out of a office in St. Petersburg, but they're Maltese people in their living rooms. Yeah.
My wife and I are collecting court orders on people not to approach our children, and they hit her in the street, and this is not the phone she had at the time. Nothing's left of that one. So yeah, I mean, because the point is, the chilling effect is in the trolling, yes, but when you know that the same people you're going to meet in the street in a place like Malta, and they're going to heckle you when you're walking with your children downtown, and then you have to explain to your children why that's happening, why this guy doesn't like you so much. Yeah, I'd like to think that it hasn't chilled me, but I imagine even unconsciously when I'm about to write something that I know is going to attract that sort of thing, when I'm going to touch upon things that are taboos. I don't know, I wrote, for example, about the leader of the opposition's ex-wife accusing him of domestic violence, beating her and her children. That was a long month after that. It happened to be Christmas time, this time last year. That was a very long month after that. We couldn't go to eat in restaurants or anything like this. And I know that I wasn't the first to come on the story, so I scooped it because nobody else would touch it, because they knew exactly what would happen, and there was the chilling effect. No, it's a real thing. Of course, it's a real thing.
Can I just add a strong misogynistic element in the abuse that women receive online? So yes, in Malta, we've seen examples of young women effectively being forced out of activism because it's gotten so nasty. And I mean, yes, some of the men get it really bad as well. I'm not saying that they don't, but there's often an added element: death threats, rape threats, really personal things, people being doxxed, and there is that strong misogynistic element. That's not just in Malta, it's even here, and it's a bigger issue online. I mean, here in this country, if you tweet anything about Carol, if you tweet about Laura Kuenssberg, for example, see what comes back to you for a few days, even kind of wading into that. But the problem is more broadly that we're seeing the blurring of online violence and real life violence now. Daphne's case is an extreme example of that, but we have to get better at taking early warning signs more seriously so that we can actually protect people and prevent more senseless violence from occurring. We can't just sort of chalk it up to, oh, this is just online, because it's no longer just staying online. And something that strikes us in particular when it ends up resulting in something like the murder of a journalist. In cases of women, there's often very similar hallmarks country to country, and it's often this online abuse. It's often things like vexatious defamation suits and et cetera, and then in the extreme end can lead to physical violence or even murder. So we need to get better at recognizing it for what it is and addressing it effectively.
Right, let's go to the last question, I think, after which we'll switch to the...
I'm publisher of the book, and I also published some John's book about the Church of Scientology and various other ones, and I just wanted to circle back to Paul's comments about the legal letters and what you can do with them. We found, John and I, because it's just me and my publisher, the most effective way to make the threats from the Church of Scientology go away was to publicise the letters. And the legal advice you had about the letter being your property and therefore you're able to do with it whatever you like is absolutely spot on. And certainly in my experience, is the absolute most effective way to make those letters go away is to make them public, because they're sent out obviously to put a lid on whatever information was coming out, and using the letter as a way to shine more light on it. I find it, I'm yet to hear of an example where a letter has been published and then the next step from the people who sent the letter has been, conclusive or successful from their point of view. As far as I'm concerned, that I'm sure there will be examples later on in the history of libel laws, etc. But certainly also just one other minor point. In this country, the libel law has changed in the past few years for the better for publishers. And the lawyer who read this, his advice, which was to sum up, don't change a word and publish it, you'll be fine, was based on three things. One is truth, so the absolute defense of truth. Another one was giving right of reply to the people about whom you were writing, which obviously they do. And the other point, I may have forgotten one or two, but the third point was whether you're actually damaging the person's reputation in the place where you're publishing by publishing what you're publishing. Sorry, it's difficult to find a better word for publishing than publishing. So that with those three factors in mind, this book was a very straightforward decision legally to publish. I know that this doesn't apply to everyone, and I know that it works differently in big companies. This is why some of these slap letters work, because if I worked for an enormous publishing company, I would have a career path to worry about. I'd have a boss. My boss would have a boss. They might have international management boards and pensions and shareholders, etc., etc. And when you put all those stakeholders into a situation, you find the decision at the very tip of the spear becomes extremely cautious, and people are wary of taking risks because there's so much at stake beyond that one person making a decision. So it's a very tricky situation to navigate. But I do think the more people whose very loud threatening letters are made public, and the louder they are, the less they want them made public. There is that. The louder and more threatening they are, the worse the ultimate publicity will be. The more of those letters that are made public, the harder it will be for them to be sent. So if ever anyone finds themselves in a situation, just fire the letter out to the world on Twitter. And thank you very much. Sorry,
thank you very much, everyone. Yes, let's thank our panel very much, and thank you all for coming. And I suggest that if anyone would like to purchase a book today, please go to the table, and you have the opportunity to be the first buyer in the United Kingdom, I suppose.
We also have the executive summary and the recommendations of our report,
which is free.
Is online. Yeah,
you can just take it. That's
and some maps.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.